I didn't believe in these stories. You know those urban legends that everyone knows? The woman in white on the side of the road, the ghost asking for a ride, the screams in the dark. I thought all of this was just talk of people wanting attention, until the day I saw her myself. My name is Nathan. I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and all of this happened a little over 2 years ago, on a cold November night. I had finished a long shift at the hospital where I worked as a nursing assistant and decided to take a shortcut along a rural road that avoided the night traffic. Denton Road. It was an old road, full of trees on both sides, with no cell phone signal and almost no streetlights. The locals always told me to avoid that road at night. The woman in white still appears there, they say, said a man at the hospital reception one of the previous nights. My cousin saw her in the 80s, and they say she gets in your car if you don't stop. I laughed, of course. But that night, with my eyes heavy and my head full, I thought of nothing but getting home soon. The road was empty. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, as if the forest had swallowed up any sign of light. My car's headlights cut through the thin fog that formed on the asphalt, and the sound of the engine was the only thing that reminded me that I was awake. That was when I saw her. At first, I thought it was an animal crossing the road, maybe a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman, standing on the shoulder of the road, dressed in white. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. She didn't move. Her dress looked old, long, touching the ground, and her dark hair fell over her shoulders. She was barefoot, her feet in the wet grass. I slowed down, looking at her figure more closely, but as soon as the headlights hit her directly, she disappeared. She didn't walk, she didn't run, she disappeared. My eyes widened. I looked in the rearview mirror, then to the sides. Nothing. The car started to sputter, and then the engine died. I stayed silent for a few seconds, just listening to my heart beating. The car's dashboard was off, and the sound of the forest seemed to have disappeared. I picked up my cell phone. No signal. I tried to start the car again. Nothing. Come on, I murmured, turning the key, and then I felt a presence, cold, silent, as if someone was behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a second, that seemed eternal. She was sitting in the back seat, pale skin, white dress, hair covering part of her face, and then she smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It was a cold, thin line, devoid of emotion. I turned around on impulse, my heart almost beating out of my chest, but the seat was empty. What's happening? I whispered. I tried to start the car again. The engine came back to life. The lights came back on, and at that moment, the radio turned on by itself. Static, and in the middle of the hiss, a whisper. Why didn't you stop? My eyes filled with tears. Panic was holding me back. I put the car in gear and accelerated, no longer looking at the rearview mirror. But even with the car moving, I felt her presence there, as if she were inside me now. I arrived home in a state of shock. I locked the doors. I closed the windows. I turned off all the lights, but the fear didn't go away. During the night, I woke up several times with the feeling that someone was in the room. And around 3 in the morning, the alarm clock turned on by itself. Static. And again, her voice. You saw me. Now I see you too. The next day, I called my grandmother, who has lived in Ypsilanti since the 1960s. She has always been into spiritual things. I told her what had happened. She was silent for a while, then said, Nathan, you need to go to the lakeside where she died. What? She doesn't want to hurt anyone. She just wants to be remembered. She just wants someone to say she was there. I thought she was joking, but that same night, I found a note in the car, handwritten, old-fashioned handwriting. You saw me. Now go to where I rested. I never left that paper there, and in that moment, I knew the lady in white was still following me. Returning to Denton Road wasn't a choice. It was like an impulse, something bigger than me, a feeling that I owed her something. After that first night, Nothing in my life went back to normal. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The kitchen lights would turn on by themselves, and every morning I would find the same note left on the counter. "Why didn't you stop?" Written by hand, a woman's handwriting. The strangest thing was that every time I threw the note away, it would come back, even after I burned it, even after I tore it up. It would always appear again, in the same place, with the same smell of wet earth and old perfume. I was being haunted, but not by hate. It was like a request, a calling. I went to my grandmother's house. She lived in Ypsilanti and was known for her spiritual connections. She always said that the world of the dead only haunts us when we want to pretend they're not there. When I walked in, she was already waiting for me with an old photo album. "You saw her," she said bluntly. "The bride." "Eleanor Grace," I replied. Her eyes widened, and she closed the album as if I'd said something dangerous. "How do you know her name?" "She left a note." "She's never done this before." My palms sweated. Am I not the first? Number, but I may be the last. Eleanor's story was well known among the old-timers. She was going to get married on a rainy October morning, but her fiancé had an accident on the curve of Denton Road and died instantly. She ran desperately down the road, hoping to find him, until she was hit by a truck that couldn't stop in time. Since then, there have been stories. Drivers see a woman in white standing on the shoulder of the road. Some say she disappears. Others swear she gets into the car, silently, only to disappear soon after. "No one has ever spoken to her," my grandmother said. "No one has heard her voice. But if she spoke to you, it's because she chose to." "Choose for what?" "To end this, or to take you with her." That night, I drove to the place where they said she died, a forgotten stretch of Denton Road, with tall grass on one side and a shallow lake on the other, a place where no one stopped. But I stopped. I got out of the car with the flashlight, trembling. On the side of the road, there were still visible marks of old tires, footprints in the dirt, and then she appeared, out of nowhere, with her white dress stained with mud, her feet bare, her eyes sad. She didn't float, she didn't glow, she didn't look like a monster. She looked lost. "You're back," she whispered. Her voice was soft, almost drowned out by the wind. "Why?" I asked. "Because no one has ever stopped for me, only you." My throat tightened. "What do you want?" She looked at the road. "I want to go home." Without knowing why, I held out my hand. She slowly approached and took it. Her skin was cold, but not dead. There was a presence there. She led me to the edge of the lake. There was a small wooden cross forgotten in the bushes, with the name of the groom carved on it. Richard Holloway, 1954 to 1973. She knelt. She touched the earth. She cried without sound, and then she looked me in the eyes. "Now I can rest." Before disappearing, she handed me a necklace, gold, with a small heart. "Take this to someone in my family." "Who?" But she was no longer there. The next day, I went to the city clerk's office. I found an address in Lansing where Eleanor's great-niece supposedly lived. When I got there, an elderly woman greeted me. "Did you know my aunt?" she asked, surprised, when she saw the necklace. I hesitated. Then I nodded. "I think so." She cried. She said she had dreamed of getting that necklace back for years, that it was a family necklace. When I handed it to her, I felt a weight lift from my chest, as if a bond had been undone. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. No lights flickered, no notes appeared, no whispers called to me. And on the car radio, when I turned it on in the morning, an old song was playing. "We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when." I smiled, because now I knew. Eleanor was gone, but I would never forget what I saw on that road. And every time I cross Denton at night, I slow down, because sometimes I still feel like she's there, just to make sure someone stops. I've never been afraid of the dark. I grew up in Michigan, surrounded by deep forests, long nights, and winters that seemed to last forever. Darkness was just part of the routine, and the sound of the wind against the windows was almost comforting. But that night, at the Big Bay Point Lighthouse, I learned that there's a kind of darkness that doesn't come from sunsets or the absence of light. It's the kind of darkness that stares back at you. It was my first week working as a temporary keeper at the lighthouse. The old keeper had retired, and I needed money and silence. I'd lost my father months earlier and just wanted some time away from it all. The offer was good: solitude, free housing, and a small salary. In exchange, I'd take care of the place, keep the lighthouse running, and report any anomalies. Simple. But no one had warned me about the whispers. The lighthouse sat on a hill surrounded by Lake Superior. Built in 1896, it was a red stone tower topped with a white dome. The attached house was small but cozy. It had an old radio, a fireplace, dusty books, and a diary from the previous keeper. I arrived on a cold November morning. The wind was already blowing hard and the waves were pounding against the rocks like hammers. The man in charge of the transition, a quiet man named Mr. Dobbins, simply handed me the key and said, "Keep the light on, every night, without fail." I thought his tone was odd, almost as if he were warning me. "Is there anything I should know?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he said, "The lighthouse doesn't like to be forgotten." He smiled and left. The first night went well. I climbed to the top of the tower, turned on the rotating light system, and spent some time looking out to sea. It was mesmerizing to watch the beam spin over the dark water. I felt isolated from the world, but in a good way. I went back to the house, made some tea, and sat in the rocking chair with the previous caretaker's journal. Most of the entries were routine: strong winds, mirror maintenance, lens checks. But toward the last few pages, the handwriting changed. It became shakier, less objective, and there, I found the first strange entry. I heard knocking on the tower stairs at 2 a.m., but no one was there. I locked the door. I stopped reading for a moment. I thought about laughing, but I didn't. I closed the journal and went to sleep. At 2:07 a.m., I woke up. 3 knocks, sure, slow, coming from the tower. My body froze. I lay still in bed, listening to the creaking of the wood upstairs. Someone, or something, was moving up there. I grabbed a flashlight and walked silently up the stairs. The tower door was locked. I used the key and slowly opened it. The sound stopped. I climbed a step, then another. With each step, the air grew colder, thicker. I reached the top. Nothing. The flashlight room was empty. The light was rotating normally. But when I turned to go down, there were wet footprints on the steps. I went back to my room shivering. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I checked the equipment, searched the outside area, looked for signs of intrusion. Nothing. No marks, no flaws. But the footprints were still on the stairs, as if someone had come in from the sea. I opened the diary again. The following pages were even more disturbing. The light flickered at 3:33, always at the same time, and every time it does, he appears in the window. I closed the diary. I looked at the clock, and I promised myself that night I would be awake at 3:33. I spent the day tense. I read the diary several times, rummaged through the cupboards, turned on the radio. Nothing. No signal. No explanation. That night, I went upstairs and turned on the light as usual. I went back to the house, sat in the chair, and waited. When the clock struck 3:33, there was absolute silence. Nothing. No noise, no tremor, no presence. I sighed, relieved. But when I got up, the bedroom window was fogged up, and on the glass, drawn with my finger, there was something written. "You saw it." I froze. The room was closed. I hadn't touched the glass, and the window looked out onto the cliff. No one could reach that point from the outside without falling into the sea. I approached slowly. The cold of the glass pierced my skin, and in the reflection, for a brief moment, I saw a man standing behind me, pale face, deep-set eyes, old lighthouse keeper's uniform. I turned quickly. The room was empty. The next morning, I found a new entry in the diary, handwritten in fresh ink, but the previous keeper had been gone for weeks. He walks the tower because he was forgotten. The light failed, and with it, he disappeared too. I closed the diary. I knew what I had to do, and what I could never allow. The lighthouse light must not go out. That morning, the sky seemed grayer than usual. The wind didn't blow. It howled, as if trying to warn me of something my eyes couldn't see, and inside, the lighthouse was colder. The wooden stairs creaked even though no one was climbing. The old paintings hanging on the wall seemed to have moved. And the diary, well, the diary was now writing by itself. I spent the day trying to find some logical explanation for everything. Maybe I was sleep deprived, or maybe it was all part of an unresolved trauma. After all, it's not easy to lose your father and isolate yourself in the middle of nowhere. But deep down, I knew. This was real. The lighthouse wanted to be remembered, and those who forgot it paid the price. That night, the wind picked up. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below seemed louder, as if the lake was trying to reach the tower and swallow it. I climbed to the top in a hurry than usual. I activated the rotating light system, tested each gear, lubricated the base, but at 10:03 p.m., the light went out of nowhere. Panic. I ran to the generator. Everything seemed in order. The cables were intact, the system functional. I turned the circuit breaker on and off. Nothing. And then, the knocking started again. 3, exactly, coming from inside the tower. But I was alone, or at least, I should have been. I ran down, grabbed the flashlight, the radio, still no signal, and locked myself in the attached house. Through the window, I looked towards the top. The tower was dark, completely. The beam of light that should have rotated and cut through the night sky had disappeared. And that was when I saw it. A silhouette, standing on the lantern ledge, motionless, watching the lake. He was wearing an old lighthouse keeper's uniform, the same as the figure I saw in the reflection of the window. I raised the lantern and pointed it. The silhouette disappeared, and the radio, which had been silent for days, began to crackle. And amid the static, a voice emerged, weak, broken. I was here. I never left. Panic took over me, but something inside me knew. I had to climb. I walked back to the tower with heavy steps. Each step seemed older, more worn, as if time inside that structure did not follow the normal rules. I reached the top. The lantern room was completely cold. I breathed in and saw the air coming out like steam. I approached the main lens. There was something written on it, inside the glass. Never turn off the light. My hands were shaking as I tried to turn the system back on, and then, the door to the room slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. The light wouldn't turn on. The wind outside seemed to push the tower, and, reflected in the broken lens, I saw it again. The man, behind me, with empty eyes, ashen skin, and an expression of anger and sadness mixed together. You've forgotten me. Everyone has forgotten me. I don't know you, I shouted, backing away. He just pointed at the flashlight. Turn it on. With a click, like magic, the system reactivated. The light shone all at once, slowly rotating. The wind stopped. The air grew warmer, and he disappeared. I stood there for minutes that seemed like hours, breathing, crying, trying to understand. I walked back downstairs on shaky legs. When I entered the house, the radio was still crackling, but now it was playing an old song, like one from the 40s, software, sad. And on the table, I found something that hadn't been there before, a black and white portrait of a man in a lighthouse keeper's uniform. On the back, handwritten, Edward Langston, lighthouse keeper, 1938 to 1957. The next morning, I took the portrait to the city's historical archive. The librarian recognized it immediately. That's Edward Langston. He died on the job. The light went out in a storm, and 3 boats sank that night. And his body? It was never found. I returned to the lighthouse with a new purpose. Every day I write in my diary. I record everything. I take care of the light carefully. I talk to the wind if I need to, because I understand. It doesn't want revenge. It wants memory. It wants to be remembered. And every night, before I go to sleep, I look up at the top of the tower. If the light is spinning, I smile. But if it ever goes out, I'll know I'm not alone there anymore, and that Edward Langston, the old lighthouse keeper, has come back to remind me of that. I have always been fascinated by forgotten places, abandoned houses, faded trails, stories buried in the dust of time. Maybe that's why I immediately accepted the invitation to spend a week on Mackinac Island, in Michigan, even though I knew it would be off-season, with everything practically closed and the streets empty. It was October, the end of autumn. The cold was already biting my skin, and the wind carried dry leaves between the island's Victorian buildings. The tourists had left. The bicycles were parked. Silence took over everything, and it was in this silence that I found home. I was staying at a small inn near the marina. During the day, I walked along the trails or visited the few spots still open, the lighthouse, the historic fort, a few insistent shops. On one of these walks, I left the main path and went down a side trail, hidden among pine trees and twisted oaks. After about 20 minutes, the trail ended in front of an iron fence covered in ivy. Behind it, partially hidden by dry trees, was an old two-story house with tall windows and a circular porch. It looked like something from another century, and the strangest thing, it was perfect. Not in ruins, nor had it been invaded, but there were no signs of life either. No curtains, no cars, no noise, nothing, just empty. I went back the next day with my camera. I took pictures of the facade, the porch, the staircase. Every detail seemed even better preserved than the day before. The woodwork was clean. The flowers in the front garden, even though it was out of season, looked recently watered. Something was wrong, but at the same time, I felt drawn to it, as if the house wanted to be seen. On the third day, I found the front door ajar. I looked around. No sound other than the dry leaves rustling in the wind. I pushed the door open slowly. It creaked softly, and then I stepped inside. The interior was even more immaculate. The main room had a beige sofa, an armchair facing an unlit fireplace, and old paintings on the walls. There was minimal dust. The wooden floor creaked under my feet, but it didn't feel rickety. On the coffee table was a newspaper, dated 1953. On the sideboard, an old record player, and in the corner, a spiral staircase led upstairs. Everything was strangely clean, as if someone had taken care of everything until yesterday. But there was no smell of life, no perfume, no mold, just the still, cold air. I went to the kitchen. The cupboards were full of china. On the old stove, a kettle. No dirty dishes, no clothes, no personal portraits. The house was a body, without a soul. As I climbed the stairs, I felt a sudden chill. At the top, there was a hallway with 4 doors. The middle one was open, revealing a bedroom with a made bed, flowered curtains, and a porcelain doll sitting on the bedspread. The doll's eyes were fixed on me. I looked around. Everything was too tidy. I walked over to the window. It looked out onto the back garden, and that's when I saw someone standing there, a woman in a white dress, standing among the trees, looking up at the house. I ran downstairs and opened the balcony door. There was no one in the garden. I came back the next day. The door was still ajar. I went back in. Everything was the same, but now there was a cracked mirror in the upstairs hallway, and the doll was no longer in the bedroom. I thought about leaving right then, but something held me back. At the back of the house, I found a half-open basement door. I went down a narrow wooden staircase. I grabbed the flashlight from my cell phone and went. The smell of earth and humidity was strong, and there at the bottom, I found something that chilled my soul. A series of black and white portraits, hung as if they were an exhibition, men and women, all with blank expressions, and under each photo, a name and a date, always between the years of 1950 and 1953. The last photo in the row was turned over, I turned it over carefully and saw myself. It was me, same clothes, same hair, same expression I had at that exact moment. I ran away. I tripped on the steps, hit my head on the corner of the door and left without looking back. That night, I locked all the windows in the inn, but at 3:14 in the morning, the record player in the inn's common room, which no one had used for years, started playing by itself. A soft song, waltz, the same song I heard in the house. I tried to tell the innkeeper what I saw, but he just laughed. That house has been empty since the 50s, man. It belonged to the Whitmore family. They all disappeared. No one ever sold it. The city tried to close it down, but it always seems intact. Have you ever been in there? God forbid. That place holds too many people. I'm leaving tomorrow, but before I leave, I know I'm going to stop by there one last time, because the house saw me, and now, maybe, it wants me to stay too. I should have left. I had a ticket booked on the first ferry in the morning. My bags were packed. The cold pressed down on me, and the winds from the lake howled as if they wanted to drive me away from the island. But I came back. Of course I came back, because there was something in that house that wouldn't let me leave. I arrived just before 5 in the afternoon. The sky was already tinged orange, and the streets of the island were, as always, deserted. I walked along the same pine path until I found the iron fence covered in ivy. The house was, as always, impeccable, silent, observant, and the door open. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I went in. Everything was the same, but at the same time, there were subtle changes. The record player was playing softly, even though it wasn't connected to anything. The doll had returned to the room, sitting in the same position, but now with a slight smile on its lips, and the cracked mirror, it was intact, as if nothing had happened, or as if everything had started all over again. I went up to the second floor and stopped in front of the attic door. It was a door I hadn't seen before, but now it was there, at the end of the hallway. I pushed. The wood creaked. I climbed the steep staircase, lit only by the light from my cell phone. Upstairs, the ceiling was low, the space cramped, and in the center of the attic, there was a circle of empty chairs, all facing a portrait hanging on the opposite wall. The portrait showed a family, a couple, and 2 children. Neither of them was smiling, and behind the portrait, hidden on a small shelf, I found a diary. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting shaky. August 20th, 1953, they came again. They sat at the table, even without a body. They talked without a voice. They wanted the house to stay alive. They wanted it to breathe. August 21st, the doll moved 3 times. August 22nd, someone new came. He saw us. He heard us. The last page was blank, but when I looked closer, words began to appear, as if an invisible hand were writing. "You're back." I ran to go down, but something on the stairs made me stop. I felt a weight behind me. I turned slowly. At the entrance to the attic, the woman from the garden was standing. A white dress, dark hair falling over her shoulders. She was staring at me with eyes that no longer belonged to this world. "You're next," she said, in a whisper that didn't seem to come from her mouth, but from the air itself. "Next to what?" My voice barely came out. "From the house." She disappeared, like vapor. I fled to the basement. I wanted to confirm that the portrait with my face was still there. It was. But now, next to it, there was another, the woman, and below her portrait, the same inscription, Eleanor Whitmore, 1919 to 1953. I looked around. The old portrait seemed darker, more intense, as if the eyes of the figures were following me. And then, the record player started playing upstairs, the same waltz, but now, with several voices whispering together behind the melody. "Stay, stay, stay." I ran up the stairs, through the house, but when I tried to open the front door, it was locked. I pushed hard. I kicked. Nothing. The house wouldn't let me out. And that's when I understood. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive. I went back to the doll's room. The door was open, and the bed was made, with a new, white, freshly ironed sheet. On the pillow was a note, handwritten. "Now it's your turn to keep everything in order." The lights in the house flickered. The radio turned on by itself, playing an old broadcast, like it was a newscast from 1953. The voice said, "The Whitmore family has not yet been found, suspected of voluntary disappearance." And then, silence. I stayed there for hours, locked in, trying to understand, trying to accept. And then, the front door opened, slowly, as if testing me. I left. I ran without looking back. I caught the next morning's ferry without even checking out. But even back on the mainland, I knew I hadn't completely escaped, because every night at 3:14 a.m., the record player plays again. And when I look out my apartment window, I see the silhouette of the house in the fog, waiting, watching. And when I leave again, it will be there, because whoever enters the Mackinac Island house never quite leaves. I've always been a skeptic. I didn't believe in spirits, curses, or things that couldn't be explained logically until I visited the Indian Cemetery in Saginaw, Michigan. I'm Thomas Evans, a freelance journalist specializing in urban legends and forgotten stories. I was in the area to investigate a supposed Indian cemetery where, according to locals, a dead gravedigger still dug graves at night. It was autumn, and the wind carried the typical Midwestern chill. I arrived at the site late in the afternoon. A rusty arch marked the entrance. No walls, no fences, just weeds, old graves, wooden crosses, and the heavy silence of a place forgotten by time. But what bothered me most was realizing that the ground wasn't still. I walked among the graves, writing down dates and symbols. Many were faded or covered by leaves. The silence was absolute until I heard the sound of the shovel. It was metallic, repetitive, coming from the east side of the cemetery. I crouched down behind a tombstone and peeked in. There was a man, digging a grave. He was wearing gray overalls, a wide-brimmed hat, and thick gloves. His movements were calm, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. And the strangest thing, there was no wake, no body, no people, just him, the grave, and the sound of the shovel cutting through the earth. I tried to record it with my cell phone, but when I raised my hand, he stopped. He raised his face. He stared at me, and even from a distance, I felt something terrible. He knew me. His eyes were too deep, too black, too empty. I ran away, tripping over roots. I ran to the car. The engine took a while to start. When it finally started, I looked in the rearview mirror. He was behind me, smiling, but his smile was crooked, almost drawn, as if his face no longer knew what it was to be human. Back in town, I went to the library. The librarian, an elderly woman, fell silent when I mentioned the cemetery. "Did you see the gravedigger?" she asked, unsurprised. "I saw someone." She handed me a newspaper clipping from 1924. The headline read, "Gravedigger dies digging grave that was never used. His name, Jonas Clay. Legend has it that every time someone wrong steps into the cemetery, he digs a new grave." "What do you mean wrong?" I asked. "Someone who shouldn't be there, who doesn't belong there." I went back to the cemetery the next day, before sunset. The grave he was digging was still there, perfect. No name, no date. But now, with a stake stuck in it, and on it, written with a knife, "Thomas." My blood ran cold. I walked away slowly, looking around, and in the corner, in the shade of a twisted oak tree, he was there again. The shovel rested on his shoulder, his gaze fixed on me, and before I could turn my back, he spoke, in a voice that didn't seem to come out of his mouth. "The grave is ready. All that's missing is the body." Returning to the cemetery was the stupidest decision I've ever made. But when I saw my name engraved on that wooden stake, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just fear. It was the feeling of being trapped in a destiny I didn't choose. That night, I slept badly. The sound of a shovel digging into the earth woke me every hour. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty, but the sound continued, as if it were coming from inside the walls. At 3:33 a.m., the noise stopped, and then I heard a knock on the window. I went to it. Nothing. But on the fogged-up window, there was a mark, a single word, written with a dirt-stained finger. Tomorrow. The next morning, I went to the city hall to look for old documents from the Indian cemetery. The clerk let me leaf through a file of deaths and historical records, and there, among the pages, I found more than I expected. In the 1930s, several people had disappeared after visiting the cemetery. All had been dug in the same place. All had names on the stakes before they disappeared. Jonas Clay's name kept coming up, even after his death. Handwritten notes from local officials read, "Jonas is still digging, says he hasn't finished the job yet." I decided to face it. I took a shovel with me and went in the afternoon. I arrived when the sun was high, praying for protection from the light, but the sky was overcast, and the wind was cold. The grave was still there, and next to it, there were 2 stakes now. The new stake read, "Today." My knees weakened. I took a deep breath and walked over to it. I touched the wood, still damp, fresh. That was when I heard the sound of footsteps on dry grass. I turned slowly. He was there, Jonas Clay. Same look, same clothes, same shovel. But now he was speaking. "You went where you shouldn't have. You saw what you shouldn't have." "I didn't do anything," I said, my voice shaking. "Yes, you did. You knew. And yet you stayed." He raised his shovel, but instead of coming toward me, he slammed it into the ground. "You choose, dig or be dug." I picked up my shovel, trembling, and began to dig. I didn't know what I was doing. I only knew that, somehow, it was necessary. With each blow, the air grew heavier. The trees around me seemed to block out the sky. And then, I hit something. I slammed the shovel down again. Loose earth. I dug with my hands until I found a rotten coffin, buried shallowly. The wood crumbled easily. Inside, there was no body, but there was an old mirror. I looked at it, and the reflection wasn't mine. It was Jonas, young, alive, dressed like me. He whispered into the mirror, "Someone needs to take my place." I ran. I dropped the shovel, ran without looking back. I went back to town, packed my bags, and left Saginaw that same night. But even far away, even in another state, the sound of the shovel still haunts me. In the silent early mornings, at 3:33 a.m., I hear knocking on the floor of the apartment. And yesterday, when I opened the closet, I found a stake with my name on it and a new date, tomorrow. I've always been fascinated by old houses, not by their structures, but by the hidden stories, in the creaking boards, in the doors that insist on closing by themselves. It was this fascination that led me to the house at 76 Elm Street in Kalamazoo, Michigan. They called it the Whispering House. My name is Jamie. I'm a real estate agent, and at the time, I was in charge of trying to sell the property that no one wanted to show. The previous owner had disappeared out of nowhere. The one before that had too, but the house was in the name of a bank now, and they wanted it occupied. "It's nothing special, Jamie, just an old Victorian house," they told me, and I, as always, accepted the challenge. But from the moment I pulled up in front of that dark facade, with its wooden windows and roof sunken in shadows, I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind of chill that doesn't come from the cold. The gate creaked as I pushed it open. The garden was abandoned. The front door was unlocked. I went inside. The smell was of damp wood, mold, and old memories. The house had 2 floors, an attic, a basement, and 5 bedrooms. The main room was huge, with thick curtains and a grand piano covered in a white sheet. I closed the door behind me and immediately heard the sound. Whispers, low sounds, as if someone was talking, inside the wall. I stood still, trying to understand. But as soon as I took my first step into the hallway, the sound stopped. I spent the rest of the afternoon making notes for the catalog. The place needed a lot more than paint and a hammer, but that wasn't all. There was something wrong with the silence there. It was too lively a silence. I began to feel the presence of someone watching me from afar, always from the second floor, always from the back hallway. When I looked there, nothing. But when I turned my back, the whispering came back. The first night I slept in the house, not because I wanted to, but because the car wouldn't start. No taxi came, no phone worked. I set up camp in the living room with a mattress and an old lamp. At 2:42 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps upstairs. I stepped onto the cold floor and grabbed the flashlight. I climbed slowly. Each step creaked as if it were screaming. At the end of the hallway, the door to the bedroom on the right was open. I went in. The room was empty, but in the center of the floor, there was a mirror framed by old wood. As I approached, I saw my reflection, and behind me, a woman in a dark dress with her hair covering her face. I turned around. Nothing. When I looked again, the mirror was cracked. The next day, I found a secret compartment in the bedroom wall. Inside was a worn leather notebook filled with notes from someone named Miles Carrick. I first heard voices in September. I thought it was my mind, but now they whisper names. Mine, my children's, my wife's. This house speaks, and it doesn't forget. The last words were almost erased, written shakily. If you're reading this, it's too late. I tried to leave the house that afternoon. The gate wouldn't open, even without a lock, even without a padlock. The hinges seemed sealed by something invisible. I turned on my cell phone. No signal. I called for help on the radio. Just a hiss. That night, I slept with the light on, but it went out at 3:17. And in the darkness, the whispers came back. Louder, clearer. They said, "You shouldn't have come in. You belong to us now. Jamie, Jamie, Jamie." The next morning, the mirror in the hallway had words written in blurry print. Stay, stay. And my reflection didn't move with my gestures. Now I write this story in the basement, with the last charge of my flashlight. I hear footsteps upstairs, voices calling my name, and beside me in the floor is a freshly dug hole. The house is alive. It speaks, it chooses, and it has already chosen me. When I woke up, I was still in the basement. The flashlight was off, my throat was dry, my mind was full of echoes. Stay, stay. Those words still vibrated in my head, as if they were whispered directly into my ears. But the morning light filtered through the floorboards. I was alive, at least I still was. I walked up the stairs slowly, trying to ignore the strange weight I felt in my legs, as if the house were trying to pull me back. In the hallway, something had changed. The walls, which had been just peeling, now had charcoal writing drawn from top to bottom. Single sentences, names, dates. I saw my name there, written over and over in irregular letters. Jamie, Jamie, Jamie. And just below it, "You have heard. Now you will answer." I picked up Miles Carrick's notebook and went back to the main room. There were pages that I swear weren't there before. New entries. She lives in the walls. She lives in the voices. The house whispers to the guilty, and then devours in silence. I shouldn't have hidden the bones. That last sentence froze me. Bones. I ran to the kitchen, where there was a hatch to an underground storage room. I broke open the rotting wood with an iron bar and went down. The smell hit me first. Then I saw the boxes. Inside them were human remains, small ones, children. I vomited right there. When I caught my breath, a voice echoed beside me. "You hid them too." I looked around. Nothing. But at the back of the room was an old mirror, covered by a dirty cloth. When I pulled, I saw my reflection, but he didn't follow me. He cried and whispered, "You knew. You always knew." I ran out of the house, or I tried to. The front door opened, the gate too. I ran to the street, but when I turned to look at the facade, it was gone. The house had disappeared. In its place, only a vacant lot with old, cracked signs. Confused, I looked for the city agent who had shown me the property. He leafed through the files. There is no house at 76 Elm Street, and there never was. What do you mean? I was there. I spent days inside it. He looked at me seriously. This street ends at number 74. After that, it's a bush. Since 1958, that's where the St. Miriam orphanage was, before it burned down. Orphanage? He nodded. The principal disappeared. They never found the children, just the basement, with the boxes. And the principal's name. He consulted the paper. Miles Carrick. I went to an old local newspaper. In the archive, I found a black and white photo of the building before the fire. It was the same house. The facade, the windows, the porch. But that was impossible. I saw it. I went inside. I lived in it. I went back to the place that night. There was no house anymore, just the feeling that something was still there. And then I heard, "Jamie, Jamie, Jamie." Whispers, coming from the bushes, from the ground, from the air. I ran again. But since then, wherever I go, I hear them. In the hotel, in the car, even inside my switched-off cell phone. The whispers continue. You saw it. You know it. You belong. Last night, I woke up to the sound of the piano in the living room playing by itself. But I was in another state, in another building, and yet, it was the same melody. Today I received a letter with no return address, old paper, firm handwriting. You took the house with you. It's not on the map. It's in you. Now, every time I look in the mirror, I see that room, the rocking chair, and a shadow, sitting, waiting. The house doesn't need to be in that place anymore. It found another, and that place is me.